The term comes from a rather interesting guy who wrote about what it was like to live in the Soviet Union in the middle of the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing. Because there wasn't really any protest at the time. What he pointed out is that everyone knew that everything was not right. They knew that those in control had no control. They knew that those running the economy were not in control, that everything was corrupt and often completely fake because the leaders were pretending they were in control. Everybody knew this, and the leaders knew that everybody knew this, but nobody did anything about it because there was nothing else. It was normal. And he coined the phrase HyperNormalisation to describe this. Somehow you knew that everything was a bit odd and a bit unreal and often fake, but because there was no other picture of the world and you were so within this system, you accepted it as normal and just went on. And what I'm trying to argue in this film is not that in any way we're like the Soviet Union. We're a very different society, but what we do share with that time is a sense among a lot of people that things are a bit odd and unreal and sometimes fake, and that those in charge know that they're not in charge, and they know that we know they're not in charge of things, that everything is a bit chaotic, uncertain. We distrust everyone in charge. We also know those in charge allow a great deal of corruption to carry on without doing much about it. We know that they're not in control of the economy. They know that we know they're not in control of the economy. But at the very same time, we are so much a part of that system that we don't have any vision of an alternative. And I include by that the left. They don't have a vision of an alternative, so we accept it as normal. When you see another newspaper article coming out saying we're actually supplying arms to the Yemen to allow the Saudis to bomb Yemen, we go, yeah, that's a very good example. The reaction is the most interesting thing of our time. We sort of expect it, that the arms industry and the government in this country would allegedly allow arms to be supplied to this war that we know is causing horrific civilian deaths, and we have no way of controlling it. We know that, and we just accept it. It's normal. But actually, it's wrong, isn't it? We know that however much we feel it might be wrong, nothing's going to change. It is impotence in the face of a chaotic world that we think those in charge have no control over, but we accept it. So it's not just impotence, we're passive and we accept it. So in a way, we are as complicit in it as our leaders. But we do that because no one gives us any alternative. We accept it as just normal. When you have an alternative, you can see suddenly something. It puts it in perspective. You've got an alternative. You see things truly for what they are, and you can pull back, detach, and go, I don't like that. This is better. Or you don't. At the moment, there isn't. And I think one of the great faults lies with the left, who say they do want change. I mean, the real change at the moment is coming from a strange, weird mixture of right-wing nationalism and racism, as far as I can see. Whereas the left are failing to offer any alternative. It feels more and more like rhetoric. I mean, I point out in the film how strange it is that in the recent years, all the attempts to change the world radically, which had a great deal of force behind them, the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square in particular in Egypt, Syriza in Europe, all have stalled. They had great power behind them. They had great goodwill behind them, and they stalled. And I argue in the film it's because they confused process with content. They assembled, they were very powerful, they had a great slogan behind them in the Occupy movement, great deal of emotional goodwill from people who would not normally support revolutionary movements, and they just stopped. I argue in the film, or I try and demonstrate journalistically in the film, that no, we're not living in the old idea of capitalism that we used to think about. What we've shifted into is a new system of power, which I see as being fundamentally managerial. There are vast new bureaucracies around us, including things on the internet, but also in finance and in management systems in all the places that many people work in. And their aim is to essentially keep the world stable. I mean, that's what finance is desperate to do. It's always wanting to monitor the world, looking for risk. Risk is a fascinating word. I did a word search on LexisNexis, which is the cuttings file of all newspapers. Up until about 1988, 1990, the word risk hardly features in journalism. I mean, it's obviously there. And then suddenly in the 90s, it rises up. And it's this, what drives modern managerial capitalism, if you can give it a word, is this desire to avoid instability, to always analyse the past, look for patterns that are happening now that look like dangers in the past, and then adjust. That there's always a sort of a right thing to be. And I see it in our own personalities as well. There's always a right way to be psychologically. There's always a right body mass index to have. There is always the right stable thing to be. Fear of change. It's very deep, not just within the conservative mindset, but also within the liberal mindset in our society, is fear of change. Look what happens when you try and change things. They point to Iraq, for example. Look what happens when you try and change a country. They point to nature and they say, look what happens when you try and change an ecosystem. You can never tell the consequences of it. And then they point back and they go, well, look what you try and do with the Russian Revolution. Look what happened there. But what they ignore is the fact that you live in a society that comes out of a revolution which has got fantastic and wonderful freedoms in it. We had a revolution in this country. It can be good, but it can be dangerous. At the moment, we live in a static world where we're absolutely terrified of all change, whereas someone like me would argue is that change can be dangerous but can also be thrilling. I think it's in these giant bureaucracies which have grown up, which are intimately related to our politics, like finance. The interesting thing about the 1980s is everyone thinks that Thatcher and Reagan really were successful, but actually increasingly historians are looking back and going, no, they weren't. They came in saying they were going to regenerate industry, but by about 1986-87, most of the industries in Britain and America had collapsed because of the economic experiment. So what Thatcher and Reagan did was they said they turned to finance and they said, can you help us? And what finance said is, well, we'll lend them money. Wages were actually collapsing at that point. So what happened is you had a switch and they gave power to finance, and finance came in and introduced the idea of lending on a much grander scale. The politicians allowed that because they facilitated all sorts of new acts of parliament that allowed all that lending to happen. So what you got is a shift away from the idea that you were on a constant travelator of increased wages, increased security in the industries you worked in. Your income stagnated and it was supplemented by lending money. Finance, for example, got a great deal of power. Now, underlying finance is a deep desire to keep the world stable, to avoid chaotic situations. So we began to move into that world where we're always trying to avoid risk. That idea begins to spread out, not just literally in terms of you lending money, but the idea of avoiding risk becomes a central thing in our society. And I would argue that we've all become terrified of change, which is conservative. But you see, I think that why it doesn't have any traction, change, it's our fault as much as them. You can't just blame the politicians. It's us as well. One of the great, enormous changes of our time is the rise of individualism. It started really in the 1970s, in modern terms. And it's this idea that you and I believe that what we want and what we think and what we feel is the only authentic thing, and we shouldn't be told what to do. It's really strong. It's really powerful. Mrs. Thatcher was on the coattails of it. Punk movement was on the coattails of it. It dominates our society. And the problem for politics of the rise of individualism is that it can't deal with it. Politics requires you to say to people as a political party, come with me, join with us together, and we will use that collective power to change the world. But to do that, you have to accept that you're part of something. You have to surrender yourself to something. And for the radical movements, that was a disaster. But more than that, it was a disaster for politics generally, because political parties fell away. So what then politicians, they were then faced by is the fact that they didn't have mass support. So they couldn't do the main thing that mass democratic politics rose up to do, which is to be your representative, your bridgehead into power. Because we had become like scurrying little piglets going all over the world and not joining together to form a collective action. No, it's not a side effect of marketing. Marketing comes in to make it work. Individualism comes basically out of the hippie movement, the counterculture movement of the 1960s, where you were encouraged to be authentic by responding to yourself. That was the idea, and it was a reaction against what was seen as conformity, and it was a reaction against old style of politics where you were told what to do. It was just, I want to do what I want to be. And it was about finding the authentic self. The civil rights movement, which is an incredibly important movement in the 1950s and the 1960s, white activists and black activists joined together and they spent years giving their lives, in many cases literally, up to trying to change the world, which they did. They surrendered themselves to that. Out of that civil rights movement came what was called the New Left. And the New Left said, well, if we can do this for civil rights, we can do this for everything. And then the movement stalled somewhere in the mid-1960s because what began to happen was a new, what was called counterculture rose up. And the counterculture was different from the New Left because what the counterculture said was, you're never going to tackle the man, the power. You haven't got the power to do it. The way to do it is to change yourself. It was the sign of a new individualism. It didn't want to go down to the south and spend years in anonymity and danger trying to change the world. So what then happened is the argument shifted away from the idea of saying we can work together to change the world to saying, no, if we can actually be the vanguard of changing ourselves as people, then you change society like that. You change the people first, and then society will transform. And that sort of worked for a bit, but then bit by bit, the politics moved away and you were left with this idea you just transform yourself. And you have all these radical psychotherapy movements of the 1970s come up, which is you need to find your authentic feelings. That became the goal. And the idea that you're actually changing society as a byproduct began to disappear. And what then happened was that this strange thing began to emerge. If you are going to be a self-expressive individual, which was the ultimate goal, where you're authentically expressing yourself, how do you do it? Because actually not many people knew or had the confidence to do that. I argued in a series of films I made that really what happened happened was that modern consumer capitalism said, oh, we can help you do that. We can actually supply you with lots of different things to allow you to express yourself, from ranges of cars to ranges of clothes to all sorts of products that you can use to express your individual identity, which was fantastic for consumer capitalism because they could make lots more different things. The capitalism is not an inherently evil thing. It's amoral. It will always spot an opportunity and it will go for it. And what it spotted in the late 1970s, that were these people rising up who wanted to be themselves, and they realized that that allowed you to make lots of a much wider range of products than you had previously done before, and people went for it, and that allowed capitalism to make lots more money. You know, you saw all those adverts in the 1980s and 1990s, express yourself, because I'm worth it was the great phrase. Then what happened? I think a great shift happened, which we haven't fully recognised, which is sort of what I'm trying to get at in the film, is the genius of modern power, is that it managed to do what politics failed to do. Politics can't deal with individualism, because how can you have a political party where everyone wants to be an individual and not be part of something? What modern managerial systems managed to do was square the circle. Look at modern social media. It manages to allow you to feel that you are totally yourself, expressing yourself online, typing it angrily or beautifully or whatever you want to do out into the internet, what you feel all the time. Yet at the same time, what you are is a component in a series of very complex circuits that is looking at you doing that and saying, hang on, if he's doing that, then he's very much like these people over here, which we've categorized like that. So we can say back to that person in the circuit, if you're doing that, would you like this as well? And you go, oh, yeah, all right, because it's a bit like what you've just done. Yeah. And it makes you sort of feel secure within your individuality. So what they've managed to do, increasingly in the modern systems of management, is accept your individualism and your expressiveness, allow you to feel that you're being more and more expressive, whilst at the same time managing you quietly and happily, so you become part of a very large group that you don't see because you're just a little component in the circuit. But the computers look at you and go, oh, well, there's about 300 million of those sort of types. We'll put them in that group. It's not a conspiracy. It's not a group of people going, oh, we'll do this. It's a system that can see from the information that it's reading from you and lots of other people, the patterns that you are part of, and saying, well, we'll fit them all together into that pattern. And it's benign in their terms. If you talk to the tech utopians from Silicon Valley, they will go, this is incredibly efficient. And they're right. It's an incredibly efficient way of managing the problem that politicians can't manage, which is our individuality and our desire to be self-expressive. Yes. Its problem is that it's fundamentally conservative because it's feeding back to you more of what it knows you like. Yes, you could argue that modern Protestantism, especially, was again another way of trying to deal with the growing desire for individuality, which has been going on since the Renaissance or before the Enlightenment. This idea that you want to be yourself. Protestantism said, no, you don't have to be what Catholicism says is just part of something you're told to do. You can have a personal relationship to God. And there is a very important posh academic book written back in the early part of the 20th century by a man called Max Weber that argues that Protestantism and the idea that you have a personal relationship to God was one of the great motor forces that allowed capitalism to come up, because if you can actually achieve a relationship through your own actions with God and achieve salvation, then you can actually say, well, I can achieve all sorts of things myself in the here and now before I die, which may save me for when I die. So it actually made you more of a heroic figure, Protestantism, so that when you die, you will be a good person and you will go to heaven. And that gave capitalism this idea that it was a fundamentally good thing to try and achieve. And you see this in the 19th century novels where they depict great capitalists. They see themselves as heroic figures who are not only helping the world, but they're saving themselves. Someone once said the sign of a great ideology is something that doesn't look like an ideology, that you just accept as natural and normal. So, for example, if you talk to technological enthusiasts or utopians from Silicon Valley, and you talk about Facebook shutting people off into their own little echo chambers, they'll say, but it's efficient. And what they mean by that is it works. It's actually dealing with the problem I was talking about of individualism, and it's allowing people to be assembled in groups, yet feel individuals. And they're absolutely right. It is incredibly efficient. But maybe the whole idea of efficiency used in those terms is actually a political ideology, because what they're saying is we constantly keep people in this situation by reading stuff and feeding stuff to them. And that's conservative. That's a conservative idea, because then people, they get frightened of change. And if you get frightened of change, then you're actually feeding the power. And what I keep on trying to point out is that real power, it doesn't work by saying you must do this. It works well when we are complicit within it because we accept it as natural. And we are guilty in that. Do you remember the march against the war in Iraq in London in 2003? Probably the biggest protest march since the Suez thing in 1956, or even bigger. And everyone thought that's going to change everything. And they had a slogan which was "Not in my name." I thought it was an interesting slogan of its time. 3 million people marched and they were totally sincere about it. Not in my name. And they then went home. You go back and the war is not in my name. Whereas real change, real political change would have happened if those 3 million people had again and again and again marched and again and worked and given themselves to that. They might well have had a chance of stopping the horror that has now happened in Iraq. Protest becomes feeling. It's not that there is the real kind of freedom is a religious one. It's a different kind of freedom. There are all different kinds of freedom. And the idea of freedom that we believe in now and we believe is inevitable and natural to our state is not. It's a construction. The version of us at the moment of freedom is a construction because there are many others. And one of the most powerful is the very opposite, which is a religious one, which says, in whose service is perfect freedom. The religious idea is that the self, which we worship at the moment, is actually a terrible prison. It's a cage that you are trapped. And again, you're an example of this. Maybe it's good to escape from that daily grind of having to listen to your consciousness, constantly saying, I want this, I want this, I want that. People live inside their heads very much because they're encouraged to. They're encouraged to think that is the end point. That's what we're heading toward. But actually, what's going on in those heads are things that people don't really want to tell.
Doubt.
Fear, loneliness, doubt. If you are going to be the right kind of individual, you mustn't have that. The politician who is going to get real power and take us somewhere in the future is going to have to deal with the things that are inside our heads, which is loneliness and fear, in whose service is perfect freedom. I mean, the other interesting area that in this is the modern ideas of love are about satisfying yourself, whereas the old idea of love was that you surrender yourself to someone else, and it's thrilling but frightening because you give yourself up. And that kind of love has disappeared. It will come back, I'm sure. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You just can't. Individualism is here to stay. It's part of the future. What a politician of the future who is going to change the world will do is somehow allow people to still feel they're individuals, yet at the same time will say, if you come together, we can actually transform the world into something extraordinary. And it will be thrilling, but it will also be frightening, and take them into that world. No one's managed to do it. At the moment, what's happened is a lot of the managerial systems have managed to make people feel they're individuals, but manage them. And we've got to transcend that. I mean, I think it may somehow come out of the internet in some way or another. At the moment, the technologists, the engineering people who dominate it, apply an engineering model to it. And engineering models are about feedback. And they say they constantly read you in the past and feed more back to you. It doesn't have to be like that. What it needs is a content, a vision of the future. And it hasn't got one at the moment. I have a very cynical theory about Donald Trump. As politics became more and more deracinated, thinned out, less and less substantial, and less able to change things or confidently able to change things, and power shifted away to all sorts of other things that we were participating in. Really what people like Trump are is they're not really politicians, they're pantomime villains. They've turned politics into a vaudeville. They come on stage and we go, this is outrageous, in big capitals. This is absolutely terrible. We tap away on social media saying this is really, really, really bad. A marketeer for online told me once, angry people click more, and clicks are gold dust. Really what those clicks do is feed modern power, and everything stays the same. If you click a lot, that's what those who run social media benefit from. You're actually keeping the whole thing churning over. If you have something like Facebook, which in its news feeds increasingly gives you what it knows you like, and what you hear is what you like, then that's incredibly powerful because you are shaping what they know, and you're shaping above all what you don't know. Those who run social media will say this is efficient. They're not ideologists. They're not saying we must tell them this. And in fact, it's the algorithms that are doing that. Of course, they've designed the algorithms, but the algorithm's function is to give you more of what it knows you like because that's efficient. That means that you only know what others like you know. And then there's another group over there who know what they know, the others in their group know, and they never meet. I mean, there's a fascinating quote on the day after Brexit from a social media activist who was a Remainer, but he wanted to find out what the other lot felt like, who were the triumphant that day. And he went onto Facebook and he tried to find through the custom feeds people like that. He couldn't do it. And he was actually shocked. I won't read you the whole quote, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's a man realizing that there are two halves of the world now so separated from each other that one half can't actually actively go and find out what the other half is feeling. Now that's called power. I don't think that in Facebook there is anyone saying this is the world we want. They're saying this is efficient. But look what that efficiency is. It's a conservative world that holds things stable. And implicitly what that means is that things aren't going to change. And what that means is that those who are in power remain in power. And then also in those chambers, anyone in your little network or big network who comes along and says something that the others don't like gets absolutely ejected immediately. The book that journalist John Ronson wrote about what it's like being shamed on social media is a very good sort of anthropological example of what happens to people within a network who say the wrong thing. It's like being in a village in the medieval times. You're just ejected if you're the wrong person. You're thrown out of town, out of the city limits. Everyone remains thinking the same, and that's conservative. But we're complicit in it. Everyone knows it. I do think that the one thing that's going to come back onto the table is religion, because I think the real weakness of the modern systems of managing us as individuals is that it cannot deal with our own mortality. I'm more, prosaic and functional than you are about religion, but I do think its main function in society has been to give people consolation in the face of their own death. The sense that when they die, something will go on and they will be part of something that's going on. It's really powerful and it's really necessary. In the modern, rational, efficient, utilitarian, technocratic world of managing the individual, it cannot give you any consolation. No. And I think a lot of the pessimism that you find on the left is from that. They're actually projecting onto the world. They're saying, it's not me who's going to die, everything's going to die. And it becomes this sort of terrible, terrible fear of death, which then colours everything, which then stops them being optimistic about changing the world. Although remember that socialism came out of religion, especially in this country. I've never really gone along with all that debauched stuff. It's all men in black who like punk music talk about that sort of stuff. I think it's in a way more mundane than that, is that every age creates its own reality. That's what power does. I mean, the function of power is to tell you a story about the world. Because what is reality? It's just a jumble of masses of things. Real power is taking the reality and shaping it. And at the moment, I think we are becoming a bit distrustful of the stories those in power tell us. And it's all feeling a bit jangly and a bit falling apart. And what we're waiting for is another story that comes along. What I find it a bit odd is that actually, rather than celebrating this moment of sort of transition from one big story to another, we're feeling so frightened rather than actually celebrating it as a moment where you can shape anything the way you want it to be. There are two things sitting around waiting. One is religion, the other is science. It's the thing that no one ever talks about at the moment, because science has got stuck in many ways in sort of weird dogma, but also because it's all about serving the individual these days. Scientists spend their time getting grants by doing research that tell us that if you eat this, you'll die, or if you do this, it'll have a bad effect on your health, and then next year telling you the opposite. It's been reduced in our imaginations, whereas what science used to do was tell us extraordinary things about the world, hidden things that it could reveal, and there's a sort of awesomeness waiting there to be rediscovered. And I have this instinct that what might happen in answer to the sort of rather strange utilitarian stuckness of our time is that someone will find a way of fusing scientific ideas and religious ideas to produce a sort of a vision of an extraordinary world that somehow has a logical power to it. The science and the religion will fuse. What it will offer is a way of us still feeling that we're individuals, but there's another world we can go towards. Islam's interesting because it combines an idea of individualism with the sense of community, and it's powerful, that. But again, in the Western world, it's very difficult to discuss Islam at the moment without getting a wave of fear and disapproval, because it's been so demonized. I'm not trying to praise Islam or be rude about it, but it's a fascinating religion to look at. Destiny Disrupted is a fantastic book, the history of the world told from the Islamic perspective. And when you read it, it just makes you look at the world differently. Yeah, and that's what we don't do these days. It's a fantastic book because it makes you pull back and look at the world differently. We just don't do that these days. But then there's always someone who comes along who crystallizes it. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the Iranian Revolution. Khomeini came along. I mean, he managed to assemble 3 or 4 different groups in society and somehow gave them a common identity. He then just killed off about 2 of the other groups. Well, I mean, what Khomeini did is he realised that there was a whole massive group of people who'd moved into the cities over the last 10 years in the 1970s who were really pissed off and felt completely alone. And he saw that group, and he also saw that there was a group of middle-class, left-wing activists, and he put the two together. Because what he did with Islam is he said, no, we can politicise it. He politicised Islam, and especially Shia Islam, which had always seen itself as quiet. It wasn't going to take any active role in the world. And that was its tradition. And he did it brilliantly. And he then took power and he got rid of the middle-class activists. He just shot them. Well, revolutions are brutal. And this is the thing that one has to go back to if you want change. If you really want to change the world, you have to tackle power. And when you tackle power, it's quite rough and things will get quite iffy. And I think the middle classes might find it a bit difficult. And I remember once at a thing with you when we were talking about this, just turning to the audience and saying, well, actually, really, you talk about revolution, you talk about change. Do you really want it? Yes. It will change the world massively for you. Or do you just want the banks to be a little bit nicer? And there was complete silence, because actually, I do think at the moment in the West, people genuinely, they're nice, they're good. They really want change, but they want change that isn't really going to disrupt the world. And I'm not sure that's really possible. If you really want to give a voice and a power and a sense of confidence to all those people outside this city who are feeling lonely and uncertain and living completely, uncertain lives, have no sense of their own confident future, you're going to have to change things quite substantially, and you're going to have to take on really vested interests. And I go back to the civil rights movement in the 1950s in America. White middle-class activists went to the South and they gave up their lives for years to do something that they thought was morally right. And as someone wrote the other day, you cannot imagine that happening now. They'd want to be telling everyone that they're doing it, because that's how you get validated these days as an individual. You want people to know that you're doing it. Most of the heroes of the civil rights movement remain anonymous. Politics is about giving yourself up to an idea beyond yourself. So is religion. It's a dominant idea about how you deal with a dynamic world. At the moment, we pretend the world is stable, but it's not going to be. It can't. But it doesn't mean you can't try and achieve good things. There are two types of political ideas of change. One is that you can actually seize history and turn it your way, which is sort of what Napoleon has tried to do. He's a great example. The other is that you understand that the world is chaos and you see a moment where you can use the chaos to morally achieve what you want to do, that it's about opportunity. But you have to do that. You have to have a picture in your mind of what you are trying to get towards, what you think is good. And then you adjust as the chaos around you changes. We do neither. We think this is it. And that's why it's frightening, change. That was a response to chaos in the 1920s. And remember that they were socialists to begin with, the Nazis. And they had seen the chaos of the market in America and in Europe, and they reacted against it and said, no, we are going to organise this and we are going to go towards this. And it's very dangerous. The other argument is that all rhetoric about revolution at the moment is just rhetoric, because the experience of our generation, of our time, is a century of revolutions that went badly wrong. And the last thing we want is one or more of them. And that actually what we're creating in reaction is a very conservative moment, a counter-revolutionary moment. And that's what we're living through. And it may go on for quite a long time. And that all arguments about revolutionary change are just like courtly behaviour. We do it, but we don't really expect it's ever going to happen. This is a cynical view. Maybe that's how history works. You go through a period of intense revolution, which does change the world. And then you have a counter-revolution, which is actually born out of the social classes that came out of those revolutions that failed, but it led to a new class breaking through, and now they want everything to be stable. The argument about what people like Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan were about is that a new lower middle class, which were confident, rose up in the 1970s and wanted its place in society. Thatcher and Reagan let that class through economically. New Labour let it through culturally and socially and gave it confidence, and now it wants everything to stop and be stable. And the systems of management that we have got in place that I'm talking about, keeping everything stable, are a reflection of that class, that powerful new class's desire for stability. And we may be in this for the long term, where we're living in our bubble in history and in geography. The sad thing about our time is there are all sorts of other things happening outside our bubble. But because we're so scared of change and we're scared of looking outside and we're scared of the future, we don't really see them. I always think the thing about our time, which is sad, is that we're a bit like, you know, when things go wrong in an airplane, you're encouraged to adopt what they call the brace position, where you hunker down, you're too frightened to look out of the window because you can see the wing going up and down like that. That's where we are at the moment. We're refusing to look outside. Everyone lives in their heads these days, like you said. They don't live outside, and most modern novels are all the internal monologue. And in a way, you demonstrate that in three-dimensional space. You're very good at bringing out the consciousness, the way people live in their heads all the time. And what you're bumping up against is what lies beyond that. And is it religion, or is that it? But isn't that what religion is in a sense about? It's about the acknowledgement of everything we don't know, and a story that is based on faith trying to make sense of what we don't know, plus consolation in the face of not knowing everything. And I think a bit of humility might be really good for our society in the future, and maybe we've reached the limits of that individualism. But maybe we haven't. Maybe this is it. You can look at Trump as the fag end of that sort of individualism started back in the 70s. I mean, the decayed end. The counterculture sitting around in the 1970s going, politics is shit, man. It ends up with Trump. And I can see he has as many roots in the punk movement as he does in the libertarian right wing.